Professor Goulder, you have done a lot of research on the economic effects of carbon pricing. How would carbon pricing affect an industrial country such as the United States?
A lot depends on the size of the carbon tax or the carbon price itself. In my model, for example, a $15 per ton carbon tax would raise about $80 billion over the next per year, and after 10 years it would achieve about a 10% reduction in the amount of emissions relative to what otherwise would be the case. In terms of its impact on the economy, it would have an impact. It would reduce GDP by somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2% 10 years from now, relative to what would otherwise be the case if there were no, that is, what would be the case if there were no carbon tax.
You've already mentioned the GDP, and my notion is that there are some people out there who are saying, well, you know, it's not that good for the GDP, and we even have to look at some job losses or massive job cuts. What do you say to that?
The job losses, most models indicate, the job picture is mixed. For conventional, for labor that's employed in fossil fuel industries, it would have a negative impact. But then again, for labor that's employed in green tech industries or in industries that compete with fossil fuels, such as the solar industry or energy from wind power, there would be increased employment. The overall, from some work that I've done, the overall impacts on labor are really pretty small.
Even though there are so many advantages of carbon pricing, market-based emission policies, such as carbon taxes or emission trading schemes, have seldom been implemented. How could political opposition towards them be overcome?
I think that there's no surefire solution, but I think that one thing that economists can do is try to explain how it is that market-based approaches can achieve particular environmental goals at lower cost than conventional approaches. There's a strong body of economic theory that suggests that they should cost a lot less, it should achieve the goals at lower cost. And there's some growing empirical evidence on that score as well. And I think a lot of it's a matter of getting the word out and also demonstrating in those places where we have introduced market-based approaches that they actually won't hurt the economy and that they can be very influential. I think the public, to some extent, can be a little skeptical about these market-based approaches. They're not convinced that raising prices is actually going to achieve much, that they're more comfortable with just setting a limit on the emissions from individual facilities. But I think over time it will be more and more evidence that they do work.
Speaking of costs, as you did, what are the overall costs of unmitigated increase of carbon emissions?
The scientists tell us that have estimated for the IPCC a range of damages to the globe depending on the amount of temperature change. And a central focal point is, suppose that over the next century, there's a 3-degree Celsius increase. In that case, the estimates are that the damages to the globe in terms of percentage loss of GDP would be somewhere between, and this gives you an idea of the range, 0% to 6, 7, 8%. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. If the temperature were to increase by 5 degrees, which some scientists say is possible in the case where there's no mitigation, the damages could well be over 6%. On the other hand, if we were to limit temperature increases to much less, then the damages would be smaller.
How do the social costs of carbon relate to the optimum price that carbon emissions should have?
Well, as you may have heard, the U.S. government recently enlisted about 12 different departments and agencies to try to estimate as best they could the social cost of carbon. That is to say, what is the damage associated with every unit of additional emissions of greenhouse gases. The latest estimates using a number of climate models centered around, for the year 2015, around $38 per ton. What that number tells you is that if you believe that's the right number, that suggests that's the number we should also use for the price of carbon, that we should be setting policy, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, so as to achieve a price of about $38 per ton. That happens to be a lot higher than the actual prices that we see. It suggests that we should be more aggressive than we have been in terms of either a cap and trade system or a carbon tax.
How do you assess the costs and political feasibility of using standards and regulations instead of market-based instruments?
If you introduce a carbon tax, industry or facilities end up paying a tax. And it's very visible that that payment is being made to the government. That's a more visible cost. In contrast, if you introduce a standard, for example, you require automobiles to achieve a certain level of fuel economy, introduce a fuel economy standard, that does raise the cost of producing automobiles, but the consumer may not see exactly how much the cost has risen as a result of the standards. So the fact that standards are less visible has made them more successful. Nevertheless, I think over time, there's going to be increasing appreciation of the fact that standards introduce costs as well as market-based approaches, and moreover, that the market-based approaches might introduce less increase in cost than introducing a standard.